Our next presentation is with Sarah Hamburg, co-founder of Phase 3 and Links, and Alexandra McCarroll, co-founder of Phase 3 Links and Kernel. And the title, no Kernel. The title of the presentation is Decentralized Science and Biotech Carta, Opportunities and Risks. What should decentralized science be about and stand for? I also want to remind you that we have the sessions in room 2 going on, and the session going on here and at this time is Pooja Olhaver on Decentralized Society, DSOC and DeSci. So we're going to start the presentation now. I'm going to pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to our talk. Just for clarification, we are guides in Kernel. Alex is not a co-founder of Kernel. So my name's Sarah. I've got a background in neuroscience and psychology. I did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and then I worked in academia for about 5 years on an interdisciplinary project looking at Down syndrome. I then spent 3 years in fintech, mostly in R&D and innovation. Last year, I went full-time Web3, working first with Absentia, an open science DAO. And then earlier this year, myself and Alex started a Web3 consultancy, which is called Phase 3. You might not be able to see it behind the chairs. We also have a startup called Links, and this is where we're exploring Web3 for biometric data with wearables to ensure that people can own their own data and also have access to a marketplace of algorithms and experiences, including participation in scientific research. So Alex, if you want to introduce yourself next. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alex. I have a background as a software and a data engineer, not a scientist. I actually did my undergraduate in history, which is like completely different, but it was research-based, which is kind of interesting, what we're going to talk about anyway. And I also worked with Sarah at a consultancy, then at Absentia, and now we're doing this. So we've worked together for quite a long time. And then first, I want to do a temperature check. So hands up, who is bullish about DeSci? Cool.
Looks about half the room, maybe.
Who is bearish? Oh, one person. Okay, cool. And who's just undecided? Okay, nice. So mostly bullish. Mostly
interesting. Okay. Very cool. That was really just for our own interests, but also hopefully you found it interesting too. So the outline of the talk today, so we're going to focus on opportunities and risks of DeSci, followed by ideas for what DeSci should stand for. And then we're going to end with some inspiration for community values and principles taken from other movements. And then we're going to launch into a workshop where we can all discuss what DeSci should stand for together. So firstly, opportunities. Where would you even start with this? So there are many problems in science, and I'm not going to go over them all here, and we've heard many of them already this week. But just to reiterate some of the key themes in DeSci. So these are unleashing knowledge and data from silos, cutting out intermediaries that extract value, diversifying and democratizing funding streams for science, and improving reputation systems beyond our current toxic publish or perish culture. And we have many groups, and many of them are already here today, already experimenting with Web3 tools to tackle these kinds of issues. DeSci is an incredibly new space. And those of us building in the space today are not just early adopters, we're innovators. It's our job to build for the early adopters. Firstly, how cool is that? And how exciting. But also, what an important job that really is. So hopefully we've all seen this many times before. It's an absolutely fantastic infographic by Ultra Rare Bio, and it illustrates the current landscape very well. Web3 doesn't just aim to solve the pain points of science that I mentioned a moment ago. It could also add gain points. It could enable new ways of doing things that we may only be just starting to imagine, and most likely can't actually imagine or envisage yet at all. So I'm not going to talk about any specific projects here, but many of these are working on tools that will likely enhance the quality of science and patient care. So I'm someone with a chronic health condition that's been very much historically been misunderstood and under-researched by science. And I'm personally very excited by the possibilities of Web3 to empower scientific communities and fuel treatment innovations. In case you're wondering, it's fibromyalgia. It's a chronic pain condition, just so that's not distracting you, wondering what it is. So we've chosen 4 topics to discuss here today, but there are obviously many risks with DeSci, and quite possibly the biggest risks we can't actually yet envisage at all and might not see coming. So on that note, on to the ones that we've chosen to highlight. So first up is commercialization, and I'm glad we've actually heard a lot about this already over the last day or two. So when things like data, insights, and IP are represented on a blockchain ledger, where they can be easily traded, they become synonymous with their commercial value. They're no longer just data sets and insights, but they're digital assets. On the one hand, this may incentivize researchers to collect and share interoperable data that is valuable to many. And this is obviously a very good thing. On the other hand, though, it's very likely such a setup will bias researchers towards generating commercializable data. This will contribute to bias in data sets and exacerbate data gaps. For example, a researcher will be much more likely to pursue studies that are likely to yield drug IP over fundamental basic research with no obvious immediate commercializable applications, but may further down the line generate whole new drug classes unbeknownst to us now, possibly unbeknownst to us ever, if such basic research is not supported and market forces reign supreme in science. Blockchain offers the possibility of being able to retroactively reward such basic research due to provenance tracking, but the nuances of how this would work in practice are as yet to be ironed out. And secondly, are we more likely to see instances of scientific fraud when, for example, there are bounties offered for data sets, or if p-values, which indicate whether your hypothesis is likely true or false, are linked ultimately to the prices of tokens that you or your DAO hold? And what about if hypotheses become synthetic assets, as Alex asked about yesterday? It's likely we won't actually be able to stop people creating such protocols when data sets themselves are blockchain assets. So what happens then? And finally, on the topic of commercialization, before I move on to the next risk, we need to be mindful of whether DAOs are operating via community building and collective action, which is their common narrative in Web3, or are they instead commercializing and potentially exploiting their communities? Let me be clearer. Many DAO contributors give their time and invest their money in return for tokens and NFTs with expectation of future rewards or gains. We call this incentives. This begs the question, and it is not specific to DeSci, but are communities being treated as a commodity, like with pyramid schemes? And importantly, what incentives and governance structures can help prevent this from happening? So, as if that wasn't enough, next we're on to the erosion of quality and the rise of pseudoscience. So this here is an extract of the A16Z article that I wrote earlier this year, and I wasn't joking about the flat earthers. We think it's actually only a matter of time before we see flat earth DAO, and DAOs for any kind of pseudoscience you can think of. At the moment, anyone could create a DAO, call it DeSci, launch a token, and crowdfund what that community deems science, and publish what that community deems validated peer-reviewed research. What about astrology DAO? 30% Americans believe in astrology, and don't worry, we won't do another poll here. When any community can do science and publish science according to the rules of that community, what research do we think people are going to want to fund and carry out? If we are removing established gatekeeping mechanisms, we need to really think about what is coming through that gate and design with this in mind. And I'm not saying we should stop these kinds of DAOs. Firstly, I don't think we actually can. And secondly, who are we to decide what is worthy of scientific research and what is not? What I am saying is we need to build systems where ordinary people can easily understand study quality. So when these DAOs do research astrology or the curvature of the Earth, anyone reading that research can understand whether it's a quality study or not. And this goes for any study too, whether it's a citizen science community or by a university. There's not really any reason why we need different systems there. Okay, collective cognition. This is a pet favorite of mine, possibly because I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and psychologist. But DAOs are a great tool for harnessing collective intelligence. But there's a downside to collective cognition, and that is echo chambers. A lot of crypto trends are simply emergent properties of social group dynamics. We're social animals, and we like to be surrounded by people who think the same as us, and we like to conform to the norms of the groups we are in. when we think about Web3 tools that DAOs are leveraging, so be it carbon tokenization in ReFi or IP NFTs in DeSci, how do communities hear counter-arguments against these approaches? And are other opportunities being missed because of the prevailing emphasis on such approaches? And furthermore, how can cognitive flexibility be encouraged when communities and entire ecosystems are heavily invested in particular solutions? And that's mentally invested and obviously literally invested as well. Okay, last but definitely not least, lack of diversity. So lack of diversity contributes to echo chambers, as illustrated by this quote by Anais Nin here. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. In science, a lack of diversity will undo decades of progress to allow women and other underrepresented groups to participate in science and be recognized as equals. This, in turn, will bias and erode the quality of science. It is imperative that groups who make decisions about science are representative of society. And if you need any more reason than that to understand why lack of diversity is a problem, because sometimes people do, let's talk about money and innovation. Research shows that diverse teams generate more profits and are way more innovative. But how can diversity be achieved when so many people globally don't have access to the internet? And how can we protect groups from exploitation? Take, for example, projects enabling people to monetize their own data and be paid for participation in research. Who do we think will be selling their personal data and participating in research? It will most likely be people who really need the money. And that echoes the earlier issue of preventing exploitation of DeSci communities. So Alex is now going to do what should DeSci stand for?
Thank you, Sarah. So taking into account the opportunities and risks that Sarah talked about, what should it ultimately stand for? So what should DeSci stand for? Should be agreed upon by the community, should happen organically, and should be able to change as the space grows and evolves. The community is not just us here today and people watching on the internet, but the wider evolving global DeSci movement. What DeSci should stand for will incrementally be decided through the actions that are taken by the community, by the builders, the contributors, and the investors, not the words in a community document. So during the first DeSci track of Kernel, a peer-to-peer learning network run out of Gitcoin, shared principles and values were discussed. These being similar to what we have already covered, but they include to put science first, to improve the reproducibility of science, to eliminate cultural bias from science, to fund research without obvious commercial value, and to build holistic reputation systems. So other themes which also came up regularly include empowering citizen scientists, building on history, working with traditional science, integrating science with the arts, promoting cross-disciplinary working, and defining value in science. The workshop we'll do after this will help us think about these themes and how to best guide those actions. And what values and principles would we all like to go towards? The output of today's workshop may include best practices, North Stars, do's and don'ts, and some guidelines. So, next let's talk about shared values and principles that we think are important. So with DeSci, we should put science first, treat science as a public good, and empower quality science. So DeSci should ensure that it puts science first, and by extension, the DeSci community should embody both experimentation and objectivity of science in what it builds and how it builds it. We should also educate those with non-scientific backgrounds about the ethos and values of science. So science is a public good. We should ensure scientific knowledge is protected as a public good. It should be non-rivalrous, meaning its use does not diminish the amount of scientific knowledge available, and non-excludable, so meaning people cannot be excluded from enjoying its benefits. In theory, this is kind of true. However, in reality, scientific knowledge is often treated as a private good, and access is excluded. So we think science should be also about ensuring scientific knowledge is treated as a public good, and teams building and funding solutions should put this at the center of what they do. It's better to earn 1% of something than 100% of nothing. And maybe we should embody like the wag me culture of crypto in that way. Okay, so thirdly, DeSci should strive to empower quality science. There's an opportunity with Web3 to create tools which improve scientific quality, but most notably through transparency, immutability, and coordination, which is what blockchain does best. Next, we're going to end on lessons from elsewhere. Open science. I think most people here probably know about open science. So if we should take guidance from anywhere, it should be the open science movement. And many projects have already taken inspiration from this. So before scientific journals, the system of not publishing discoveries caused problems. Discoveries were not shared quickly because it was difficult to prove who the discoverer was. This system instead relied on aristocratic patronage, in which scientists received funding from wealthy patrons. The funding of science therefore gave prestige to the patron, and scientists were thus under pressure to satisfy the desires of their patrons. And this discouraged open research. Eventually, individual patronage systems no longer provided the output which society needed. And therefore, in England, in 1660 in England, the Royal Society was established, and in 1666, the French established the French Academy of Sciences. This represented a trend towards pooling research by multiple scientists into an academy funded by multiple patrons. These drivers for more science more often led to the institutional system of science we have today. So then, with the advent of the internet, the open science movement emerged at the beginning of the 21st century. I think Sonke also talked about this a bit yesterday. So open science aims to make scientific research, including publications, data, physical samples, and software, and its dissemination accessible to all levels of society. It encompasses practices such as publishing open research, campaigning for open access, encouraging scientists to practice open notebook science, and broader dissemination and engagement in science, and generally making it easier to publish, access, and communicate scientific knowledge. There's also open research, which is often used quasi-synonymously to address the gap of just science. And so this includes the arts, humanities, and social sciences. The primary focus of connecting all disciplines in a widespread uptake of new technologies and tools, an underlying ecology of the production, dissemination, and reception of knowledge from a research-based point of view. So for a long time, there was no global normative framework covering all aspects of open science. However, in November 2019, UNESCO was tasked by its member states during their 40th General Conference with leading a global dialogue on open science. It's 2 seconds, sorry, just popped up again. Global dialogue on open science. And this is what they came up with. So this was published in September 2021. And this is a draft recommendation for what open science should be. And I think it could be, like in the workshop, could maybe look at this document, explore it, see what they've come up with. It's quite a long document, but it's really interesting. Before this, 2 UN frameworks set out some global standards for application of open science and closely related concepts. The UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers, approved by the General Conference in the 39th session in 2017, and the UNESCO strategy on open access to scientific information and research, approved by the General Conference in the 36th session in 2011. And then we believe that it's worth building upon these standards in the working groups because they've already been established. Next. Cool. So these are some of the existing 6 principles of open science. So open methodology, open source, open data, open access, open peer review, and open educational resources. Next. So what is the difference between open science and DeSci? Pooja's talking next door, and Tyler, yeah. So I really like what Tyler says here, and he says, DeSci could help make the theory proposed by the open science movement much more possible in reality. The main arguments against open science tend to focus on the advantages of data ownership and concerns about the misuse of data. This is what blockchain and Web3 tools help to solve. So next, we're going to touch on the open source software movement. So open source also exists as one of the principles of open science, so it's complementary. So according to the open source way, the practice of open source community management can seem like its own form of incomprehensible madness, especially to someone who is unfamiliar with how open source software gets made, or those who find themselves staring down the prospect of having to coordinate others and join in making it. Open source is tough. It requires, above all else, the ability to coordinate. And actually, Gitcoin, there was an article that the founders wrote about this, I think this time last year, which is really interesting about the coordination problem. So I recommend that. So this is the problem that Gitcoin is actually seeking to solve as well, and they're aiming to build and fund an open web together. So their values and principles are to connect the community developing public goods, creating financial freedom, and defining the future of the open web. This encompasses themes of community, freedom, financial stability, open access, and longevity of the open source mission. So according to the open source way, the open source software movement believes in transparency, so this includes open access to the information and materials necessary for doing our best work. And when these materials are accessible, we can build upon each other's ideas and discoveries. And we can also make more effective decisions and understand how decisions affect us. Also collaboration, so we are free to participate, we can enhance each other's work in unanticipated ways, we can modify what others have shared, and we can unlock new possibilities by initiating new projects together, and we can solve that no one has ever solved before. And so we can implement open standards which enable others to contribute in the future. And also release early and often. I think somebody spoke about this the other day, but this is one of the main drivers of open source and why software is what it is today and not what it was in the 90s. So rapid prototypes can lead to rapid discoveries. An iterative approach leads to better solutions faster. And when you're free to experiment, you can look at problems in new ways and seek answers in new places. And you can learn by doing. So, inclusive meritocracy. Good ideas can come from anywhere, and the best ideas should win. Only by including diverse perspectives, which Sarah touched on, in our conversations can we be certain we've identified the best ideas, and decision makers continuously seek those perspectives. We may not cooperate by consensus, but successful work determines which projects gather support by the community. And also community. Communities form when different people unite on a common purpose. Shared values guide decision-making, and community goals supersede individual interests and agendas. The DeSci movement stands on the shoulders of the open science movement and the open software movement. Therefore, we think it is important to highlight these before our workshop. So next, some questions, and then we'll move on to the workshop. See you.
No questions?
The first question is always the hardest, I think. So if anyone has questions, if not, we can just go jump straight into the workshop. Okay.
I'll bring over the mic to whoever has a question because we are live streaming and recording. Any questions? Oh, great.
Hi, my name is Andrei. Obviously, it seems like there's a huge movement in the open science. Why do you think that not many people from the open science are here in the DeScience? And how can we bring them here? Maybe work together?
So it's a good question. I think firstly there are quite a lot of people here who have been part of maybe the open science movement before in one way or another. A vote. Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, let's do a vote. Who would say that they are or have been involved in the open science movement in this room? Cool. Okay, maybe like 20%. Yeah, and then, but I think secondly, we're so early. Like as I said before, we're super early, and I think until until we kind of like have better ways of communicating, better channels of communication, better language, like which is less jargony and just easy for people to understand, I think we're going to be quite lonely for a little while longer. But yeah, I think the more I talk to people about this, like once you explain beyond the jargon and the lots of all the different themes, I think people tend to get it. But I do just think it's partly a timing thing, but also maybe people aren't necessarily labeling themselves as part of the open science movement, or they're not like necessarily labeling themselves as part of DeSci. Like I know people on either side who don't necessarily feel like those terms resonate with them. So I do think that's also partly a communication thing as well. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is David. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really informative. You already touched on this, but I was wondering if you could elaborate how to, let's just say, absorb or at least interact with the tribe of astrologers and, well, neo-mystics. How could we educate them to join our mission?
I love this question, partly because, full disclosure, my mum is an astrologer. And we have lots of conversations about astrology and science all the time. And she actually recently read a book written by a scientist about something. And she said to me, is what you're doing with DeSci going to help people who are like these scientists who do this kind of like out-of-the-box research, like not out-of-the-box research, just out-there research, let's say. And I had to kind of say yes, because I was like, well, yeah, it's permissionless, right? Like anyone, as I said, anyone can start a DAO and like do some science. But I think this is what inspired me to talk about that earlier, is it has to be about the tools, because I don't think we can gatekeep on what is science and what isn't science. And if people want to research astrology and fund that themselves, like, yeah, cool. But like, you need to make sure it's proper science, right? You need to make sure you're using scientific tools and all those things so that anybody coming along can actually look and see, has it been validated in this way, and like what statistics have been used, et cetera, but we need to make that accessible. So I think it's an age-old question, like the science and the pseudoscience, but I think it'd be a great workshop that in itself, to be honest. Thank you for the question. Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt that question because we're not recording it. I have the mic here with somebody asking a question, and then I'll bring the mic there, okay? Thank you.
Hi, sorry to interrupt your question. I'm Duncan, for everyone else in the audience, but you guys both know me. Yeah, so building on that point about pseudoscience, so we're talking about like astrology and like flat earth theory here. But really, in terms of like societal consequences, it's quite benign, really. So, but what about the question about areas, whether pseudoscientific or not? So, and it's like eugenics on one hand, but then on the other hand, say certain aspects of like nuclear physics and research there, and about creating atomic bombs and the sort of implications for terrorism there. How do we kind of deal with that aspect? Because that's very much not benign.
So I think the question's about, again, differentiating between science and pseudoscience, right? And like what's benign and, sorry, I didn't quite.
Yeah, so something like, I mean, the science behind nuclear physics or like creating like a hydrogen.
Sorry, the mic's going in and out and I can't hear.
Does that work now? Oh, here we go.
I can hear you now. Hi, Duncan.
So yeah, like creating like a hydrogen bomb or like the schematics for that, for instance. It's still the scientific process, but used in a very malicious way. And it's not something that necessarily should be public, global knowledge. So how do we deal with issues like that?
It's a great question. I think, again, that would probably need a whole workshop. But yeah, so the question's about malicious science. Yeah, I think we'd need a whole workshop on that. I think ultimately the tools we're developing will help with scientific quality, but then it would have to come down to communities and governance, like as we have with traditional structures, to determine like what's for good and what's for bad. And even then, I think it can sometimes be difficult for people to come down on one side of the argument or another, but it's an interesting question. Thank you, Duncan.
Okay, so I'm Jonathan. I had this question related to the earlier distinction between pseudoscience and non-pseudoscience, and how you said that DeSci is kind of also helping to scientists to think outside of the box, right? And some of them might be pseudoscientists, but I guess this is exactly the key. This is exactly the difficulty, to build the system that distinguishes between this and pseudoscience. Because yesterday we were talking a lot about this dogma, which is kind of problematic, because it's actually true that you have problems like we had in Alzheimer's research, where the established scientists kind of keep the conversation in terms according to their own dogma. So you need someone to break out of this in a scientific way and be like, no, I have different hypotheses. I'm going to test it. And you need to kind of be able to allow this kind of conversation and at the same time distinguish it from pseudoscience. That's exactly what you need. That's exactly the tool that the scientists want, so that they can, especially as students, when they are not yet fully developed scientists, because once you're at the cutting edge, it's easier. Like, you don't need peer review, because you are the peer reviewer. Like, you just read it and you understand it. But that's what we need to build, right? In the first place.
I completely agree. I think this is tapping into what the workshop's about. So it's about values and principles. It's like, what values and principles would enable us to do that with DeSci? Like, what do we need to guide people towards building? Because it's about building, right? What tools do people need to be able to achieve that? So I think maybe we're moving into workshop territory here, which is really great to see, but like, we don't have the answers for it. I don't think even us here today will necessarily have the answers. That's why it has to be a community effort. But yeah, I love the line of thinking.
We just have 2 more questions, and then we'll move to workshop.
Thank you.
Hi, Manav. I just wanted to ask, so we're talking a bit about basically how to keep science sanitary, right? And that's what this question really is. What it comes down to is not only the line between pseudoscience and science, but sort of where bad scientific practice kind of makes legitimate scientific inquiry pseudoscientific, right? Whether that be statistics or whatever. And yesterday, something that was sort of touted as very exciting, something that DeSci has over open science that I'm kind of skeptical about, is this idea that via token, because we have token funding and all of this other stuff, we can sort of gate access to grant and stuff like that, funding basically behind certain sanitization protocols. You have to double blind your studies maybe, or maybe you have to put all of your data sort of live stream it almost onto the blockchain and things like that. So I wondered what your thoughts were about how this conflicts with the sort of open science mission to keep things very trustless, keep maximize autonomy of scientists to do things their own way, and how we sort of resolve that with the DeSci incentives to gate funding behind certain things.
Keep the microphone, because I need to. So what you mean is that you think there's a conflict between sort of you need to keep some things private, like double-blind trials, but then there's also an openness. Is that what you mean?
So what I was getting at is the idea that to prevent pseudoscience and to prevent all of this stuff, there's you can leverage certain DeSci protocols and blockchain things, funding in DeSci can be gated behind doing science in a particular way, following certain methodologies, which sort of gates out stuff that we consider pseudoscientific. But at the same time, there's sort of a conflict with the whole idea of decentralizing science to make it more open, more accessible, to give scientists more autonomy. So I was wondering how we resolve these two things.
It's a paradox, right? It's similar to the paradox of tolerance. I think it's just something that, there will have to be nuances in every single science that will have to come up with their own sort of values and principles within this. And it's a difficult question, because how open is too open, and then you making it too closed then. So I do think that's the power of almost having a loose set of values and principles. So, even Discord, you have to sign terms and conditions when you join each Discord. You have to say, I adhere to this community's values and principles. So I think that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense, but I just wanted to ask as well that isn't this just recapitulating to everything that's wrong with science at the moment, where like basically you may have like an arms race to like the sort of like to get the best science, because there's obviously like financial incentive to produce like the best science, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you're going to have like an arms race to like the most sort of structure and stuff like that. And you'll basically end up right where we're at right now, where you have to go through like so many arbitrary loopholes just to like put out some research, you know?
Yeah, that's the danger. Will it look any different? I don't know. Yeah, no idea. I think that's up to people building in the space. That's why it's important to keep things like science as a public good at the forefront and almost make it not open to people who don't believe that that's should be at the forefront, if that makes sense. So there is some sort of locking off, but also like some protection, but also it's for the general good rather than for an individual's good. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah. Okay.
Hey, thanks for the talk. My name's Akash. My question is around this idea of designing DeSci in an equitable way. So currently in the scientific world, clinical R&D is very historically has this diversity problem where different ethnic groups tend to not be included in clinical trials, and that has major impacts on the drugs that get approved. Some drugs will not be efficacious for different ethnic groups. Within Web3 and DeSci, it's still such a small minority of the global population that is participating in this ecosystem. I think we're still very early on that early adopters curve. So are we just building DeSci in a way where the rich are going to get richer again? Like how do we guarantee, how do we build equitable scientific research at the very beginning of this process?
Yeah, I think that's why we want to create some values and principles, essentially, because without that, it's very, very difficult to answer that question or any of the questions we've posed today. So today, we pose questions to you, and it's great that you're posing questions back to us, but we need to come together as a community and work through these and purposefully create things which will help mitigate against all the things we've spoken about today, like biases in data sets and lack of diversity and pseudoscience. Like, I think until we have that, we're probably just going to keep on coming to these events and talking around in circles again, and like it's really difficult to come up with answers until we even have like a means of how we can come up with community values, which is partly what we wanted to address in our workshop as well. So, Alex also has.
And there's also just there's like DeSci movements all over the world. That Sarah, there's Japan, China. They're not happening in English language. They're happening in Japanese and Chinese. But like even if you as an individual just like open up and try and look into these spaces, that's like one way of making it more decentralized and inclusive. And even things like on a Discord channel, like having a different language in the, like a language channel. There's just little things. I think it's like, there's not like an overarching solution to this, but it's keeping it in mind and being very open to being more inclusive of other people and having like a more self-awareness of your own bias when you're hiring, of when you're doing research, of when you're collecting, and when you're designing your trials and making sure it's not just, the same people. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Alexandra.